The email arrived just before sunrise. Karoline Leavitt sat in her Washington apartment, Bible open beside her laptop, sipping black coffee when the official notice flashed onto her screen. The header was blunt, the sender unmistakable. U.S. District Court, Office of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. A federal summons. No warning, no negotiation, just a command. Appear before the bench. Apologize publicly for your statements regarding the judiciary, or face censure. She didn't flinch. For weeks, Karoline had been a lightning rod, speaking at rallies, defending religious liberty, calling out activist judges she believed were distorting the Constitution. She had named names, and Judge Jackson's court was among them. But this wasn't a debate on Fox News. This was real. A sitting Supreme Court justice invoking her authority to drag a 27-year-old press secretary into federal court, and not over a crime, but over a comment Karoline had made in a church in South Carolina. Her words had been simple, but sharp. No robe, no bench, no title gives anyone the right to silence truth. Apparently, someone in the audience had recorded it. It went viral. Within hours, mainstream media branded it a direct swipe at the High Court. Within days, Judge Jackson's office issued the demand. Her staff panicked. Even a few allies urged her to soften, to apologize. But Karoline? She called a meeting with one message. I don't kneel to pressure. I kneel to pray. In the background, news outlets spun the narrative. CNN called it Karoline versus the court. MSNBC branded her reckless. Even some conservative pundits went quiet. But Karoline, unshaken, pulled out a leather-bound copy of the Constitution, ran her fingers across the First Amendment, and whispered, "This is my defense." The court date was set for Friday. Washington buzzed. Protesters gathered on both sides. Twitter exploded with hashtags, #Karoline v. Jackson, #Free Speech on Trial. Her legal team prepared a standard statement, apologetic, vague, diplomatic. She tore it up. I'll speak my truth, in that courtroom, with that judge watching. And so began the countdown to a moment no one could script. A 27-year-old conservative firebrand preparing to walk into federal court, not with a lawyer's brief, but with the Constitution in her hand. And not to apologize, to remind them who still owned the First Amendment. Friday came with a chill in the D.C. air. Not the kind the weatherman predicted, but the kind that rides in on tension, on headlines, on 1,000 whispered predictions outside courtroom doors. The entire block around the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse was cordoned off, lined with reporters, staffers, protest signs, and silent men in suits with earpieces. Something big was about to happen, and they all knew it. Karoline arrived without fanfare. No entourage, no PR team, no press conference. Just her, in a red and black blazer, cross necklace gleaming beneath the collar, a leather-bound Constitution held tightly in her hand. She looked like she was walking into battle, because in her mind, she was. Inside the courthouse, staffers scrambled. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson had taken her seat earlier than usual. Known for her composure and intellect, she wasn't new to media attention. But this case, this girl, this moment, it was different. She wasn't just presiding over a hearing, she was presiding over a clash of narratives, legacy power versus rising voice. As Karoline moved through the marble corridor toward the courtroom, she passed by framed portraits of former justices and granite walls that had echoed with landmark decisions. But instead of feeling dwarfed by history, she felt summoned by it. Her heels clicked with purpose. Every step sounded like a reply. You don't scare me. I came here to speak. A young security officer tried to whisper, You can still walk away from this, ma'am. Karoline looked him in the eye and answered, That's the difference between them and me. I don't walk away when it matters. Outside, MSNBC was airing a live panel. She'll crack, one guest predicted. She's playing martyr, said another. Only one commentator leaned into the mic and muttered, Or maybe we underestimated her again. Karoline entered the courtroom. It was silent, packed. Cameras were not allowed, but every journalist's pen twitched like a loaded trigger. Judge Jackson looked up, stoic, poised. Her gavel rested nearby, unused. This court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Karoline didn't blink. As the hearing opened, the judge's clerk read aloud the official complaint: inciting disrespect toward the judiciary, promoting public distrust, and refusing to comply with advisory warnings issued by the court. Then, silence. The judge finally spoke. "Miss Leavitt, do you have anything to say before we proceed with disciplinary review?" Karoline stood, slow, deliberate. She didn't reach for notes. She didn't clear her throat. Instead, she lifted the Constitution in her right hand and said, "Only one thing, Your Honor. I came to court with what you asked me to forget." The room shifted. Some gasped. One reporter scribbled furiously. The judge's expression didn't move, but the air had. Everyone could feel it, and Karoline hadn't even started. The silence in the courtroom wasn't passive. It was electric, like the pause before thunder. All eyes were locked on Karoline, and still, she didn't rush. She held the Constitution like a lantern, her voice calm and precise. "Before I speak to the charge against me," she began, "let me speak to the charge I carry with me every day as an American citizen. To defend this." She raised the small book just slightly, her thumb pressed against the First Amendment. A few audible sighs came from the gallery, unsure if this was bravery or political theater. Judge Jackson adjusted her glasses but said nothing. Her gaze, however, had sharpened. Karoline continued, "I was not summoned here because I committed a crime. I was summoned here because I committed an idea. I said a sentence, 12 words, in a church, with no script, no cameras, no campaign." She turned her head slightly toward the audience, then back to the bench. "I said, no robe, no bench, no title gives anyone the right to silence truth." That line hit like a firecracker in a dry room. One spectator dropped his pen. In the second row, a woman whispered, "She said it again." Judge Jackson leaned forward slightly. "And you stand by those words?" Karoline didn't hesitate. "With every breath." The judge's voice was measured, but unmistakably firm. "You understand the implications of defying the court's advisory request?" "I understand the implications of obeying when I shouldn't," Karoline replied. "History has plenty of examples of that, too." A murmur rippled through the observers. The bailiff turned toward the gallery and held up his hand for silence. "Your Honor," Karoline said, now stepping away slightly from the defendant's table, "if I apologize for telling Americans to speak boldly, what precedent does that set? That conscience is allowed until it's inconvenient?" Judge Jackson narrowed her eyes. "This is a courtroom, not a campaign rally." "And this is a courtroom because I spoke," Karoline answered. "If I had stayed quiet, we wouldn't be here." The judge paused. "So you came here not to apologize, but to make a statement?" Karoline slowly placed the Constitution on the table in front of her and replied, "No, Your Honor. I came here to ask whether that document still means what it says, or whether it's now selective." That landed hard. Even among the most seasoned journalists in the room, jaws clenched. A producer from NBC was already whispering into his earpiece, "Clip this." She just flipped the courtroom. Judge Jackson leaned back, her face unreadable. But Karoline could feel it. The shift. She hadn't come to plead. She came to provoke something deeper. And she had just drawn first blood. Judge Ketanji Brown. Jackson's fingers curled together over her notepad, the silence between her and Karoline stretching like a taut wire. Behind her calm exterior was something far more calculating. She wasn't just deciding on a disciplinary ruling. She was gauging how far this young woman was willing to go, and whether the system she represented could absorb it without cracking. "I remind you," the judge said slowly, "that the authority of this court is not up for debate." Karoline didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her boots echoing on the polished courtroom floor. "Then may I ask what part of the First Amendment is?" There it was again. Not arrogance, but precision. The kind of rhetorical scalpel that didn't scream. It cut. Jackson lifted her chin. "You are here under review for language that was interpreted as inciting distrust in the judiciary." "And respectfully," Karoline said, "I was never under the illusion that the judiciary was above the trust of the people." Gasps again. Quieter this time, not out of outrage, but awe. A voice from the gallery broke decorum. "She's right." Jackson struck her gavel once, not in anger, but control. "One more interruption, and I will clear this courtroom." Karoline looked toward the judge, calm but unwavering. "Let them stay, Your Honor. They deserve to see this through." The courtroom fell still. Jackson didn't order anyone out. She didn't need to. The air now belonged to the two of them, not a judge and a defendant, but two figures locked in a deeper trial, one not just of conduct, but of principle. Karoline turned and walked slowly to the podium. "I was told to apologize," she said, her voice stronger now. "But I cannot apologize for exercising the very right this room was built to protect. If judges are immune from public accountability, then freedom becomes decoration, not doctrine." One of the court stenographers, mid-typing, momentarily froze. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You presume to lecture this court on the nature of liberty?" "No," Karoline said. "I'm here because this court presumed to lecture the people on the limits of their speech." That line cracked like thunder. The judge didn't respond immediately. She glanced down at her notes, lips slightly pursed, then looked back up. "Miss Leavitt, do you understand that continuing this posture may lead to formal sanctions, including public reprimand, fines, or disbarment from future federal testimony?" Karoline nodded. "I do." "And you accept those consequences?" "If the price of keeping my voice is losing your approval, I'll pay it." Somewhere in the press bench, a journalist whispered into his recorder, "This isn't a hearing anymore, it's a showdown." And Karoline, with that single sentence, had made it so. The courtroom, once just formal and expectant, had become something else entirely, a furnace of ideology, tension, and something no judge can summon and no defendant can control. Momentum. Karoline wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was now a live wire inside the federal system, and she knew it. With slow intent, she picked up the Constitution again, not dramatically but deliberately. Her thumb landed once more on the First Amendment. And then, eyes steady on Judge Jackson, she began to read. "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." The words rang out clearly in the marble chamber, spoken not with defiance, but conviction. It didn't sound like a defense. It sounded like scripture. Judge Jackson waited until the final word was spoken. Then, calm as ever, she asked, "And yet you believe this gives you the right to openly undermine the credibility of the judiciary?" Karoline looked directly at her. "It gives me the right to criticize power, including yours. And if the judiciary is above criticism, then it's not justice. It's aristocracy in robes." The courtroom didn't move. No pens scratched, no feet shifted. The only sound was the quiet churn of restrained breath. "Your Honor," Karoline said, "the Constitution wasn't written to protect judges from discomfort. It was written to protect citizens from silence." Jackson's jaw tensed. Not visibly, not enough for cameras, if there had been any, but enough for those in the room who studied power. "I don't fear judges," Karoline continued. "I fear what happens when everyday people stop speaking because they're told they're unqualified to challenge you." Now even the bailiff had stopped breathing. A ripple of something, not applause, but something adjacent to reverence, passed through the courtroom. One by one, jurists, staff, and even press members leaned forward, not just to hear, but to listen. Judge Jackson finally responded, and her voice was quieter than before. "You are correct that the Constitution guarantees free speech, but it does not shield you from consequences," Karoline nodded. "And I accept that. But if you punish me for speaking, what message does that send to every young woman watching, every student with a question, every believer with a conviction?" She paused. Let the words settle. "That truth is allowed only if it's polite. That courage only counts when it conforms." Now even those who had dismissed her as performative were reconsidering. She placed the Constitution on the witness table with care, as if it were breakable, sacred, alive. And with one final look to the bench, she said, "I brought this book today not because I forgot the rules, but because you did. The judge's gavel stayed untouched. The courtroom, and the country beyond it, was no longer under the court's command. It was under Karoline's spell. Outside the courthouse, America was already listening. News vans clustered along Constitution Avenue. Reporters spoke into live feeds with growing urgency, phrases like constitutional showdown, Karoline versus the court, and unexpected turning point, bouncing between networks. On social media, hashtags surged. She brought the Constitution, First Amendment trial, Karoline won't apologize. The courtroom may have been closed to cameras, but it was wide open to the world's imagination. Inside, Judge Jackson maintained her composure, but something had changed. Her measured authority was intact, but the rhythm now belonged to Karoline. The courtroom had gone from a stage of reprimand to a field of reckoning. "Miss Leavitt," the judge said, tone clipped but not dismissive. "Do you believe that your position gives you immunity from responsibility?" Karoline didn't blink. "No, Your Honor, but I believe responsibility should never mean surrender." The phrase landed like a hammer, poetic yet piercing. Even Judge Jackson, who had once wielded Senate confirmation hearings like a scalpel, found herself navigating new terrain. A young woman unafraid, unflinching, and undeniably effective. Karoline turned to the courtroom gallery, scanning the faces. A group of law students, a young pastor in the back row, even a woman in a hijab clutching a small flag. She hadn't come for applause, but she saw who was listening, who needed her to speak without trembling. She faced the judge again. "I was taught," Karoline said, "that the power of our system comes not from fear of authority, but from faith in freedom. If I apologize to preserve my career, what lesson do I teach those who watched me rise?" Judge Jackson leaned back in her chair quietly. Karoline stepped toward the bench now, only a few feet away, not to intimidate, but to bridge the divide. "When I entered this building, I was told I could end this quickly by saying I was sorry. But how can I apologize for speaking aloud what millions are afraid to whisper?" She gestured toward the Constitution again. "This isn't a relic. It's a promise, and I came here to keep it." The gallery remained breathless. From her seat, Judge Jackson exhaled, the kind of breath that suggests reflection rather than resistance. "Miss Leavitt," she said slowly, "you've said your piece. The court will recess briefly before continuing." The gavel struck once, a hollow sound against the storm that had already been unleashed. As Karoline sat, one of her aides leaned close and whispered, "That wasn't a defense. That was a declaration." Karoline nodded, voice soft but sure. "Good." Then they finally heard it. Outside, the nation didn't wait for the judge's ruling. They were already casting their own verdict. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the judge exited for recess, but the atmosphere remained electrically charged. It wasn't just about Karoline anymore. It was about what she had ignited. For those watching remotely, for law students glued to live stream coverage, and for millions following the flood of quotes and clips, this wasn't a hearing. It was a reckoning. Back in her seat, Karoline remained poised. She wasn't scrolling through a phone, didn't whisper to aides, didn't rehearse. Her fingers rested on the table close to the Constitution. Her cross necklace still glinted softly under the lights, a quiet symbol of the voice they had tried to temper. Down the hall, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson stood at a small window overlooking the city. She was no stranger to pressure, but something about Karoline's tone, her lack of performance, unsettled the usual script. This was no courtroom stunt. It was conviction, unpolished, unrelenting, and raw. As she returned to the bench 20 minutes later, the courtroom rose. The silence was heavier now, not fearful, but anticipatory. Judge Jackson cleared her throat. "This court has reviewed the comments made during today's proceeding. The defendant has offered not an apology, but a defense rooted in personal conviction and interpretation of constitutional protections." A pause. "The court recognizes the fundamental right to free speech, but must also weigh the responsibility that comes with platformed influence, especially when directed at the judicial branch." Karoline raised her eyes, not defiantly, but alert. "Miss Leavitt," the judge continued, "you were summoned here not for who you are, but for the magnitude of your words." That line cut both ways. Jackson continued. You have made clear that your intent was not incitement, but expression. And this court, while disagreeing with the implications of your remarks, cannot ignore the constitutional foundation on which you stand. Gasps again, subtle, muffled. But they came. Therefore, Jackson said, no formal censure will be issued. But let this stand as a statement of concern. When powerful voices speak, they echo. Be careful what they carry. It was a verdict of compromise, but not a victory for the system. Karoline stood, and then she broke every rule of decorum, just enough to matter. With respect, Your Honor, if the system is shaken by one voice reading the Constitution aloud, maybe it's the system that needs to be careful. She didn't wait for a reply. She gathered her book, turned, and walked out. Steady, confident, unbroken. No apology, no permission. Just a door swinging open behind her, and a nation still holding its breath. As Karoline stepped beyond the courthouse doors, sunlight broke through the clouds like a spotlight aimed squarely at her. No media team had prepped her exit. No statement had been coordinated. But within seconds, cameras surrounded her. Microphones pushed forward like weapons and invitations all at once. She didn't flinch. She didn't pose. She just walked, calm, deliberate, her constitution still in hand, her expression unreadable. A reporter shouted, Karoline, how do you feel about escaping censure? Another barked, are you trying to launch a movement? But Karoline stopped only once. Not for a headline, not for a soundbite. A teenage girl, holding a cardboard sign that read, The First Amendment matters to me too, stood alone on the steps, trembling as Karoline approached. Karoline smiled, touched her shoulder, and simply said, Never forget who it protects, especially when they tell you it doesn't. And then she kept walking. News cycles exploded. Fox News called it a constitutional stand. MSNBC fumbled to explain the judge's decision without acknowledging Karoline's rhetorical win. Twitter flooded with clips. TikTok users lip-synced her lines, and Gen Z dubbed her the Amendment Avenger. But the most surprising reaction came from within the legal world itself. A Harvard law professor tweeted, You don't have to agree with Karoline Leavitt to recognize what she did today. She reminded a federal court that the Constitution isn't decoration, it's declaration. Meanwhile, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, still behind the bench, sat in her chambers reviewing the transcript. She wasn't angry. She was something rarer, introspective. Karoline hadn't broken the court, but she had broken its comfort. That night, Karoline returned home to hundreds of calls and messages, some supportive, others vicious. Her team urged her to rest. Her lawyer cautioned that the battle might not be over. But Karoline, in her living room, opened her leather-bound Constitution one more time and circled the words, Congress shall make no law, abridging the freedom of speech. She closed the book gently, placed it on the table, and whispered, That line held. Today, it held. It wasn't just a legal moment. It was a cultural line in the sand, and she had been the one to draw it. Karoline awoke the next morning to a political battlefield. Not in the streets, but across the airwaves, on Capitol Hill, and in inboxes from Washington to Wichita. Her speech had traveled far beyond courtroom transcripts. It was dissected by legal analysts, memified by teenagers, and debated by anchors who had once dismissed her as a fringe figure. Not anymore. She wasn't fringe. She was frontline. On CNN, one panelist sneered, She's weaponizing the Constitution. A senator tweeted that Karoline's words were a dangerous distortion of judicial integrity. But others, people who hadn't spoken up in years, began posting videos reading the First Amendment out loud, calling it the Karoline Challenge. For every insult hurled her way, another voice stood up. Teachers, veterans, students. Not all conservative, not all religious, but all deeply American. Because what she had defended wasn't partisan, it was foundational. But the blowback had teeth, too. A major university rescinded its invitation for Karoline to speak at its commencement. A network pulled her from a guest panel. One outlet leaked a hit piece, Karoline Leavitt's Dangerous Rise. Her team gathered, visibly concerned. You need to lie low for a while, one advisor warned. "They're going to come harder now," another said. A strategist even suggested issuing a partial clarification, just enough to slow the firestorm. Karoline stared out her office window, arms crossed. Then, after a long silence, she answered, "We don't teach courage by backing up. Aid." "Then what's the next move?" She turned, calm but razor sharp. "We go speak again. Somewhere they can't cancel." That afternoon, she posted one sentence on social media. "You can disinvite me from your stage, but not from my country." It went viral in minutes. The next day, she showed up not at a media studio or donor event, but at a community center in Richmond. No camera crews, no handlers, just her. A wooden podium, and a stack of pocket-sized constitutions she handed out herself. The crowd was small, but the message was clear. She wasn't chasing a moment, she was the moment. And as the country scrambled to place her, firebrand, patriot, provocateur, she was already preparing her next move. Because this wasn't the end of her fight. It was only the warning shot. 1 week later, the U.S. Capitol buzzed with whispers. Rumors spread of Karoline being invited to testify, not to defend herself, but to speak on constitutional protections in an age of political censorship. Some called it absurd, others called it necessary. But the name on everyone's lips was undeniable. Karoline Leavitt. She entered the chamber alone, refusing security detail, and wore the same green jacket she had worn in court, the one with the gleaming cross necklace underneath. Some saw it as defiance, others saw it as faith. Karoline didn't care how they saw it. She knew what it was, a reminder. The chamber filled quickly. Lawmakers leaned forward. Some rolled their eyes, but all were listening. She stepped to the mic, didn't ask for silence, and didn't start with greetings. She opened with a question. If the founders stood here today, would they recognize what we've done to their words? Silence. The First Amendment wasn't meant to protect the powerful, it was meant to protect us from the powerful. She scanned the room. We've created a culture where questioning judges is labeled incitement, where reading the Constitution aloud is called dangerous. If that's the state of the Union, then maybe the problem isn't the voices rising. Maybe it's the ears that refuse to hear them. A few jaws clenched. One senator muttered under his breath, but none interrupted. Karoline pressed forward. "You don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to remind you, liberty isn't a suggestion, it's a demand." A ripple of energy swept the room. When a judge asks me to apologize for quoting the Constitution, what happens when a teacher does the same to her student? When a pastor does it to his congregation? When a journalist gets fired for quoting it on air? She leaned forward slightly, voice firm. This country was born because someone refused to apologize for thinking freely. A beat. I don't fear cancellation. I fear forgetting. She stepped back. The mic went silent. No applause, no gavel. Just stunned quiet. The kind that only comes when someone says what others were too afraid to even think. After she walked out, the committee chairman turned to his aides and said, "That wasn't testimony. That was a turning point." Later that night, Karoline posted one final message. "They told me to apologize. I handed them the Constitution instead." And as the country replayed her words on every screen, the world didn't just remember the hearing. It remembered the woman who made them listen. This story is a fictional account, but its message echoes something very real. When Karoline Leavitt stood in that courtroom and refused to bow, she wasn't just defending herself. She was standing up for every American who's ever been told to sit down, be quiet, or apologize for what they believe. What happened here may not have taken place in real life, but the idea behind it should live in all of us. The Constitution isn't just paper. It's not just history. It's a living promise. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a citizen can do is refuse to say, "I'm sorry." Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because next time we're turning the spotlight on someone else who thought they could silence her, and failed.